Hey world civilizations, Mr. Lassiter with you, and in this video we're going to look at the war in the Pacific. Pretty much to the end, not quite the end in the treaties. Let's look at our video goals today. We want to see why Japan pursued an aggressive policy in the Pacific, why they bombed Pearl Harbor, which we've talked about before, major events in the Pacific theater, and how did the United States respond to the quote-unquote Japanese threat at home and abroad. Here you see the leadership in Japan. I really couldn't find a better place in this video to put it. So here they are. Emperor Hirohito, who you see on the left, formerly known as Emperor Showa, and Prime Minister Hideki Tojo on the right. These are going to be the leaders of Japan throughout World War II. Emperor Hirohito will maintain leadership in Japan until the 1980s. He himself is seen as a semi-divine leader of Japan. So let's talk about Japanese expansion. So in order to understand this, we need to go back actually kind of all the way to World War I, actually before World War I. Japan had become a major industrial power in the 1800s. If you remember when United States warships arrived, instead of being like China and fighting against it, they said, all right, we'll trade with you and we will industrialize too. And so by the time World War I ends, Japan is a major industrial power, one of the top in the world. Japan's an island, though, kind of like Great Britain. And so, like Great Britain, they had to look elsewhere for raw materials. And so they looked to the Asian mainland. As we continue to see Japan's industry grow, we also see their military grow and their military leadership taking more active role in the Japanese government. And they're going to pursue a policy of expansion. This is seen when they take over Korea back in 1905, and then also post-World War II, or post-World War I, excuse me. They take over German-held territories in China after World War I. And then as we get closer into the 1930s, we see Japan occupy a region of China known as Manchuria. It's a Chinese province, actually, and there's something called the Manchurian Incident, which happens, where Japanese leaders staged an explosion on a railroad line that supplied Japan. And so they use this as an excuse to invade Manchuria, and they do that. They rename it Manchukuo, and just a few years later, they invade the rest of China against the wishes of the United States and Great Britain. Japan will also spread into Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and you can see here on this map the Japanese Empire and how it spread. So for the most part, by the time we get to about 1940 and Japan signs the Tripartite Pact with Italy and Germany, they are controlling most of the Pacific Rim. Now, the United States was not keen on this Japanese expansion, and so the U.S. attempts to stop the supply of oil and other resources to Japan. The United States is the only other real major power in the Pacific, and so Japanese leaders started to think about a quick strike against U.S. naval bases. They hoped this would convince Roosevelt to accept Japanese dominance in the Pacific. And they believed that Americans really didn't want any part of the war. And if they could damage the American Pacific Fleet located in Hawaii, then the Americans couldn't fight back. And so as we talked about the other day, on December 7, 1941, Japanese bombers attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. And this image is of the USS Arizona, which is still at the bottom of that harbor and can be visited to this day. But the very next day, the United States declares war on Japan. Luckily, the fleet was not crippled, and so the United States can quickly begin a war against Japan. So through 1941, Japan's aggression in the Pacific really allows them to spread their empire rapidly. And if you look at this map, you can see the maximum extent of Japanese control up to 1942. But in 1942, the tide of the war is going to change dramatically. The Battle of Coral Sea, which you can see down here, the major battles. In this battle, the United States stopped Japanese advancement toward Australia. By the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, this is a major turning point in the war. And the main reason is because United States planes attacked and destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, which basically cripples their fleet in the Pacific. The Battle of Midway is right here, if you can see where my mouse is. So the United States begins, after crippling this fleet, their invasion to work their way to Japan. And you can see that path of invasion. The General Douglas MacArthur leads the invasion of the Philippines, pushing toward Japan. And what the United States did, they practiced a policy of island hopping. There were just far too many islands the Japanese controlled to fight a battle on each island. And so they would occupy some islands and capture them, and they would bypass others on the way to Japan. And the goal was to take major strategic islands and cut off the other islands from the center of the Japanese government. So by the end of 1942, the United States has started pushing Japan back, and Japanese hopes are fading, especially after Midway. And then as we get into 1943, 44, these policies of island hopping really has got Japan on the run. So again, United States forces on the offensive, moving at times slowly, at times quickly across the Pacific toward Japan. And in 1945, the United States achieves 2 major victories at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, 2 different islands. And the victories at these islands open up basically a path to start bombing and possibly invading Japan. You can see here, this is the famous image of the United States raising a flag on Iwo Jima Island, even though the battle would continue to rage. Now, the United States will begin bombing Japan as a way to try to get them to surrender. Of course, they want unconditional surrender. But the United States really wanted to avoid an all-out invasion of the island. And the reason being, it was estimated the United States could lose over 1 million men in an invasion of the island of Japan. If you recall, even the Mongols could not invade the island of Japan. So this is something that the United States did not want to have to do. So President Harry Truman, who became president when Franklin Roosevelt dies in office, ends up with a very difficult decision. And I want you just to listen up to this. We'll go into it a little bit more later. But throughout World War II, the United States had a secret project going on. It became known as the Manhattan Project. That's what it was known as. That's a code name. And in this project, the United States had been tipped off that nuclear energy could be harnessed to make a bomb which would be so destructive that it would be possibly a bomb that could end all wars. And so throughout the war, this Manhattan Project, carried on in secret, develops nuclear weapons. It actually develops 3 atomic bombs. One that is tested, and the other 2 which will eventually be dropped on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in southern Japan, leading to Japanese surrender. We're going to get into this a little bit more later, so just make sure that you kind of have an idea of what these terms are. You probably know a great deal about this already, but if you don't, look out for the coming weeks. Now, we don't want to just stop with what's going on in the war in the Pacific, because that is obviously important, but another important thing to think about is what the home front looked like in the United States. And especially what the home front looked like for Japanese Americans. After all, there were a lot of Japanese Americans in the United States, especially in the West. And the government of the United States was worried, whether rightfully or not, most likely not, that these Japanese Americans would serve as spies for the Japanese government and would report back to Japan. And so because of this fear in the United States, Japanese Americans are treated with suspicion. They face racism. There are examples of racist propaganda, racist political cartoons, even drawn by the man Theodore Giesel or Dr. Seuss himself. And so this was not uncommon to see this type of racism toward Japanese Americans. And so the United States decides to put Japanese Americans into what are called internment camps. These were basically camps in the middle of nowhere where Japanese Americans were forced to leave their homes, leave the cities where they lived and worked, and live in these communities. You can see the posted orders for all persons of Japanese ancestry to report to these camps, and a picture of one of the camps below, where they were literally fenced in. Now, even though the United States later apologizes for this, it is important to know that the United States government deemed that it was constitutional. The Supreme Court actually hears a case from a Japanese American, Korematsu, who sues the United States and says this is a violation of his civil rights. But the Supreme Court sides with the U.S. government in this case and says that no, because it is a matter of national security, Japanese Americans can be forced into these internment camps. We're going to look at this a little bit more and discuss it some more in the future, but I think it's an important part of American history that you're made aware of, especially as war raged in the Pacific. Here are your video goals. Make sure you can answer the questions. Have a good day.